وإن أتعلم وتعليم وتذكر وتذكير ونفع وانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على تمسك بكتاب الله وسنة نبيه والدعاء إلى الهدى والجلاد إلى الخير وصلة الأرحام كل ما نواه مشايخنا ابتغاء وجه الله وثوابه وقربه. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما نافعا يا كريم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. So we're continuing in the chapter of talaq, which is a sub part of the bigger chapter of marriage and things that have to do with marriage. We talked about last week about khula, right, where both parties or one party can offer to that the husband can offer to the wife a choice of whether she wants to remove herself from the contract of the marriage, or she can ask for that choice, but it has to be ijab qabul. It can be in exchange for some sort of monetary gain or something, anything that is suitable for a mahar. It can be used as an exchange. So I'll give you this if you allow me to divorce myself. So, and we mentioned that in normal case, it will become talaq ba'in, right? But if the iwal, the thing that's being used in the contract as an exchange, then if that is not valid to be used in Sharia, then it becomes raja'iyya, because it's as if there was nothing to exchange, right? So I said, if he said, or she said, allow me to do khula in exchange for this pig, right? So there is an exchange, but the pig is not a valid iwad in the Sharia, so that wouldn't count, and then it would end up being raja'iyya because there's no exchange. Exchange makes it so strong, it makes it stronger, thus making it ba'in. But now we're going to another one, which, like we were mentioning, goes back to a very specific urf, a custom of the Arabs, right? And this was there in pre-Islamic Arabia. This is something that they used to do. So it's called al-zihar. So he says that the meaning of zihar itself, lughatan, meaning the dictionary meaning, you can call it, is back to back, right? Back, just like safaha means hand to hand, right? It's a two-sided action. Mufa'ala, form 3, is a two-sided action. So, and form 3 has two masdar, right? Mufa'ala and fi'al. So you have mudahara and zihar, right? So it means back to back. So when two people are enemies to each other, they turn their backs on each other, right? But in regards to the Sharia, this word stipulates when a Muslim man, he ascribes to his wife he says a statement in which he says that his wife is like, so there's a resemblance there, that his wife is like something for him that is a certain body part that is haram for him, pretty much, right? It's usually used with the mother, right? So if he says, إذا قال, as the Musannif says, رحمه الله تعالى, إذا قال الزوج لامرأته, if a husband says to his wife, أنت علي كظهر أمي, that you are upon me like the back of my mother, right? Or even if he says, أنت كظهر أمي, so without the علي, right? Then she is haram for him. She becomes haram for him. So this was done in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and this is mentioned in Surah Al-Mujadalah, that this was done. A man did this to his wife, and she did not want to be separated from him. But according to the urf, that was the way you divorce somebody. That was one of the ways you could divorce somebody. So the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't have revelation about it, so he didn't say it, right? But because of her ibtihal and her tawajjuh to Allah, her pleading and focusing and directing her worship to Allah and devoting herself to Allah in the night, and begging to Allah to help her out of this difficult situation. Allah revealed to her, it's the surah, Mujadala, to the Prophet ﷺ, where he says, قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا. Right? Allah has heard the statements of the woman who came to you regarding her husband. Right? So somebody who devotes themselves to Allah, MashaAllah, the doors of the heavens are open if somebody with complete sincerity were to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for something. Right? Even revelation was sent down because of her dua. Right? So the way out of this situation, to where it wasn't an effective divorce, was revealed. So how to, if he says it to her, then she's haram on him, but there's a way out. There's a way to mend the relationship. So he says, وَقَدْ حَرُمَتْ عَلَيْهِ وَلَا يَحِلُّ لَهُ وَطْءُهَا وَلَا لَمْسُهَا وَلَا تَقْبِيلُهَا حَتَّى يُكَفِّرَ عَنْ ظِهَارِهَا. It is not permissible to have intercourse with her, nor to touch her, nor to kiss her, until he expiates, he does the expiation from the zihar, from what he has done. Right? So obviously the verse of the Quran mentions من قبل أن يتماسا. Right? وَالَّذِينَ يَعُودُونَ لِمَا قَالُوا. Those who want to go back on what they have said. Right? So once it's said, it's said. Right? But those who want to go back on what they have said, he mentions here, right? وَالَّذِينَ يُظَاهِرُونَ مِن نِسَائِهِمْ. Those who have done zihar with their women. ثُمَّ يَعُودُونَ لِمَا قَالُوا. Then they want to go back on what they said. So فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. Then first thing that must be done is to free a slave من قبل أن يتماسا, prior to them touching. And this يتماسا means intercourse. So why, if that means intercourse, then why are we adding touching her, right, and kissing her as well? Why? Because those two things lead to intercourse, right? And so anything that leads to a haram, right, but that necessarily leads to haram, will take on the same ruling as that thing. So those were added because they are dawa'in al-jima', right? There are things that lead to that. So Allah says, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, right? Then to free a slave. Right? So this is how a person were to go back on what they said, to undo what was already done. So this is the method Allah mentions. First thing is to free a slave. And then slave does not have to be a Muslim slave, which is a khilaf with us in the Shafi'iyya, or as Imam Shafi'i, he makes qiyas, he compares this verse to the other verse of qisas, right? That if you kill somebody, وَمَنْ قَتَلَ مَنْ كَانَ مِنْ قَوْمٍ عَدُوٌّ لَكُمْ فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مُؤْمِنَةٍ. Right? So, and if you accidentally kill somebody, right, and then you have to free a believing slave. Right? So Allah specifically mentions the qaid, believing slave. But in our usul, that anything that is considered general will stay general until later on specified or qualified. Right? So we cannot change what Allah mentioned here. Free a slave. General, right? Includes Muslim, includes non-Muslims as well. Right? So we cannot qualify that, limit that without any reason to do so. So first step is to free a slave. So he says, فَإِنْ وَطِئَهَا, right? If he does have intercourse with her, قَبْلَ أَن يُكَفِّرَ, prior to doing the kafara, the expiation, meaning prior to freeing the slave, or prior to, if he can't free the slave, then there's two more steps after that. If he does it prior to doing that kafara, استغفر الله تعالى ولا شيء عليه غير الكفارة الأولى. Then he will make tawbah to Allah, because it's haram for him to have done that. But we're not going to say now that he has to do two expiations. No, right? The first one counts, and the first one is all that is still upon him. وَلَا يُعَوِّدُهَا حَتَّى يُكَفِّرَ. Right? And he will not continue now to go back to her. have intercourse with her until he does the kafara. Right? If he messed up and he had intercourse with her, then we would say make tawbah to Allah, but you still have to do that first kafara, and that's enough for you. You don't have to continue to do kafara for each time. Yeah. Any questions so far? Because the rest is going to be based on this. Another? So, Allah. والعود الذي تجب به الكفارة أن يعزم على وطئها. Okay, the situation, he tells her that you are like the back of my mother, right? He is making a semblance between her and someone who is mahram, it's haram for him, right? So, does he have to do kafara? If he wants that to be considered a divorce, then he doesn't have to do kafara, right? He only has to do kafara if he wants to go back on what he has done. He wants to undo what he has done. He wants to keep her in the marriage contract. He wants to keep that going. Then, and he intends to continue in his marriage with her, then he has to do the kafara in order for them to be able to have intercourse.
So what do you consider like a talaq? If he just says it and still wants to get back with her? Like what do you have to do with nikah?
It's kind of وإذا قال أنت, so that's the normal surah that they would use the word ظهر, right, back, right. But now if we said, okay, he doesn't use the word back, he uses some other body part. Yeah, so he says قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى وإذا قال أنت علي كبطن أمي, you are like you to me are like the stomach of my mother, right? أو كفخذها, or like her thighs, أو كفرجها, or like her private part, and is still considered as ظهار فهو مظاهر, is still considered ظهار. وكذلك يعني the same حكم applies إن شبهها بمن لا يحل له النظر إليها على التأبيد من محارمه. The same thing applies if he doesn't specify his mother. He uses another person, but that person is also a person who is his mahram. He's not allowed to look at, or anyone who he's not allowed to look at ever. Right? على التأبيد. You have people who are not ajnabi, they're not strangers, but it's not mu'abbad, it's not forever, like a person and his spouse, right? The spouse is not from his family, she's not a blood-related family member, but because of the contract, she is halal for him at that time. But if he divorces her, then she is no longer mahram, right? She's no longer halal for him to look at. So if he says that you are like the back of my sister, right? You are like the back of my auntie, right? My paternal auntie, my father's sister, right? Or like my mother from rida'a, my nursing mother, right? So all the same ruling would apply. Same ruling would apply. So, and there's a lot of different situations here. So he mentions. So all of those people that were mentioned are all mahram. They're all maharam على التأبيد. They're maharam and they will always be maharam. So, either by lineage, like his mother or sister, right, or his auntie, or by hukum, like her mother from rida'a, or his sister from rida'a, right? وكذلك يعني the same ruling applies. كذلك always going back to وكذلك الحكم. إن قال رأسك علي كظهر أمي, your head to me is like the back of my mother. Oh, your private part is like the back of my mother. Your face is like the back of my mother, or your neck, or half of you, or a third of you is like the back of my mother. All of these different situations. That, no, one second. Okay, so in regards to your head, right, your private, your face, and your neck, these words, the Arabs use them to refer to the whole body, right, to refer to the whole. And we have this idea in Arabic where you have ذكر البعض إرادة الكل, right, to mention a part, whereas you mean the whole. And this is common in the Arabic language. So Allah says in the Quran, وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ ذُو الْجَلَالِ وَالْإِكْرَامِ, that the face of your Lord will remain, right? Right? كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكٌ إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ, everything will be destroyed except for his face, right? Does it mean only the face? Right? It means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his entire essence, right? But the Arabs, they would do this, they would mention a part and intend the whole, right? And they would mention usually parts that are noble, parts that are like the face. That's the most common is the face, right? But as far as half of you and a third of you, right? He says, لأنه يثبت الحكم في الشارع, that the ruling still applies because it refers to the whole as well, just like it's mentioned in talaq. It'd be good for somebody to go back and find where it's mentioned in talaq. Okay, so those are the surahs. So that's clear, inshallah, so far. That these are clear words that were used, right? Clear expressions that were used for dhihar, right? The most common, obviously, is the dhahar. That's why it's called dhihar, right? The back, right? And the ruling will apply to all of these. But now, right, and we mentioned the reason for that because these are words that are used for the whole, or they apply to the whole. But now he's going to mention a few extraordinary, a few unique situations. So the ruling slightly changes. So he says, وَإِنْ قَالَ, and if he says, أَنْتِ عَلِيَّ مِثْلُ أُمِّي, that you, to me, are like my mother, right? Then it goes back to his intention, right? Because that is not a clear word which is used for this thing. And this is similar to what happens in talaq, right? If a person says talaq, then there's no need for an intention, right? Because that word is not used for any other thing, right? But if a person says, for instance, go back to your parents' house, right? Or uses other words, now we need an intention in order to figure out exactly what he intended by that. Right? If a person says, go wait until your womb is empty, or your womb is completely free, right? فَاسْتَبْرِئِ رَحِمِكِ, right? Because that is done in the iddah, right? That's what one of the purposes of the iddah is, that she is certain that she's not pregnant, right? Because of the lineage. If she were to get married immediately after being separated from him and marry somebody else, and then she's pregnant, then there's no way to know 100% whether it's the second person's baby or the first, right? And nobody could bring the objection that, well, we have tests for that, right? Majority of the world doesn't even have cell phones. We don't even realize that, let alone DNA tests, right? People don't. So Islam is for everybody. It's not just for the wealthy and those who have technology. So he says that it has to go back to the intention. Even if he doesn't say alayya. So Anti alayya mithlu ummi. We go back to intention, right? If you just say Anta mithlu ummi, Anti mithlu ummi, you are like my mother, then again it goes back to the intention. In order for us to understand what he meant. فإن قال أردت الكرامة. If he says, or somebody asked, we asked him, okay, what was your intention? I was trying to honor her. Right? You're like my mother. My mother's a great person, and you're just as great. فهو كما قال. Then it was karamatan. It was not dhihar. If he says, I intended dhihar, then it's dhihar. Right?
What if he intended divorce but lied about it after? So when he was asked, "What did you intend by?" He said, "I didn't mean divorce." Would it be like a sinful marriage? What would be the
Well, qada'an, right? As far as, because we can only judge by the outward. If he says that I intended karama, right, or I intended dhihar, but he actually intended talaq, then that is between him and Allah. But we can only continue our judgment of the situation according to what he said. Right? Between him and Allah, he's zani, right? If he continues to be with her after it actually being a talaq, right? But for her, even for her, she would not be sinful, right? That's between him and Allah, right? And people, they should have a fear of Allah. But not, these are things. The rest of his life, he'll have to deal with it. He'll have to go through sin. She will not be sinful, right? Because we can't. La yukallifu Allahu nafsan illa wus'aha. Alright, so if he says, I intended talaq, right? I didn't intend dhihar. I intended talaq. Then it's talaq ba'in, right? And then he leaves. There's one last possibility which he leaves for us to read. He says, وَإِنْ لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ فِيهِ نِيَّةٌ. If he doesn't have any niyyah, right, which in this time is very common. Why are you doing it? I don't know. Right? Why are you doing it? I don't know. Why do you pray? I don't know. Why are you reading Quran? I don't know. Right? Neither here nor there. Like Allah says, مُذَبْذَبِينَ بَيْنَ ذَلِكَ وَلَا إِلَى هَؤُلَاء وَلَا إِلَى هَؤُلَاء. Right? And they're bouncing around in between the two. Right? They're neither there nor here. Right? So if he doesn't have any niyyah, right, he just said it, just came out of his mouth, no niyyah at all. There's no ruling attached to it. It's nothing.
Is this only in the Bihar that's done with unclear words? Or
That's a good
does this
question,
occur for
actually.
the explicit Bihar as well?
That's a good question. Yeah, because this all goes back to the situation where he said, you're like my mother. Right? Which is very unclear. What do you mean by that? Right? Am I like your mother in the fact that your mother is haram for you? Right? To marry? Right? Or did you mean it like you're like my mother, meaning same personality? What was meant by that? So yeah, so all of these, and he mentions that يَفْتَقِرُ إِلَى النِّيَّةِ. All of these يَفْتَقِرُ إِلى النِّيَّةِ. Right? That the intention, in order for us to make any ruling about what was said, we have to have an intention. Right? Whereas the dhihar itself wasn't used for anything else. Right? So he mentions here that if he intended karama, to honor her by comparing her to someone who is honored to him, his mother, right? The Sharih rahimahullah ta'ala says, لأن التكريم في التشبيه فاشن في الكلام, right? That because to make this simulation being a type of honor for somebody else is something that's common in speech, especially in Arabic language. Right? So, but dhihar, nobody would say dhihar intending karama, right? Would say those words intending karama. Right? So there's no ta'wil. needed. And if he said he intended talaq, then that is a type of tashbih, right? Where he's making a semblance between her and his mother, right? In regards to the impermissibility of him marrying his mother, right? So that's specifically regarding the hurmah of his mother. So it's almost as if he said, "You're haram to me," specifically. So you are like my mother, right? And meaning in haramiyah, if you can say, in the hurmah, in prohibitedness. So you're like haram to me. It's almost the same thing. So if he intended talaq, it's talaq ba'in.
How does saying you're haram for me intend divorce? Is it just because it's implicit as a divorce?
Yeah, so that would be one of the kinayats as well. Right? You should need an intention. So like talaq straight, then that's doesn't need an intention, right? What do you mean haram for me? Meaning, maybe because you're in the room, I always think about haram, right? There's room for, right? Or every time I see you, I get angry and I start doing, right? I break glasses, I do haram things, right? What did you mean by that? So there's a necessity to have an intention. So if he intended talaq, then khalas, it's talaq. Right? Just like in kinayat, right? If I go, I don't want to see you again. Get out of the house, right? What did you mean by that? Right? If he intended talaq, it's talaq. Who knows? Bad. Right? And the kinayat. And if you didn't have any niyah, then laysa bi shay. Right? This is according to Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Yusuf. Imam Muhammad, a bit more strict. He said, no, that's bihar also. But many of the scholars, they said the Sahih is Imam Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf. Imam Burhani, Imam Nasafi. ولا يكون الظهار إلا من زوجته. So zihar only applies to his wife. Why? Because Allah says, وَالَّذِينَ يُظَاهِرُونَ مِن نِسَائِهِمْ, from their women. Right? So and that word is used for wife. Like for instance, imra'ah. So you say, وَامْرَأَةُ فِرْعَوْنَ وَامْرَأَةُ نُوح وَامْرَأَةُ, that, right? About Abu Lahab, وَامْرَأَتُهُ حَمَّالَةَ الْحَطَبِ. So imra'ah is used as wife. So the plural of imra'ah is? Who knows? Nisa. The plural of imra'ah is nisa. It's one of those ajib words, right? Like for instance, the plural of ummahat. Where did the ha come from? Right? There's a unique words in the Arabic language. So Allah says, وَالَّذِينَ يُظَاهِرُونَ مِن نِسَائِهِمْ, right? Regarding their wives, their women, meaning their wives. So he says, فَإِنْ ظَهَرَ مِنْ أَمَتِهِ, right? If he does zihar to his slave girl, then it doesn't count as zihar. So if he said to his slave girl that you are like the back of my mother, right? Then it doesn't count as zihar. Because zihar is a type of talaq, and there's no talaq for a slave. Right? There's a itq, there's a freedom. You can free a slave, but you can't divorce a slave. Yeah. وَمَنْ قَالَ لِنِسَائِهِ, if a person says to his wives, plural, right? They're all of them in the same room, all four wives in the same room, or two or three, and he says that you all are like the back of my mother to me, right? Wow. He said, كَانَ مُظَاهِرًا مِنْ جَمَاعَتِهِنَّ. He is considered مُظَاهِرًا, to have done zihar to all of them at once. وَعَلَيْهِ لِكُلِّ وَاحِدَةٍ كَفَّارَةٍ. And for each and every one of them, he has to make a separate kafara. Right, so 4 slaves. Right, we haven't finished what are the 3 types of possible ways to make kafara. And obviously, if one doesn't have a slave, then there's a second one. If they can't do that, then there's a third one. So there's not three options, but there's a process of three possibilities depending on a person's ability. So he has to do that 4 times. So if he does have 4 slaves, then the only way he can go back to those wives is if he frees those 4 slaves. La ilaha illallah. Right, this would be, so he says that it will be for each and every one who would have to do al-zihar, the kafara for zihar, because it's similar to him having said to all 4 of them, right, all of you are divorced. Right? So in that situation, all 4 would be on iddah, right? All 4, he'd have to do individual raj'a to them if he were to make raj'a. So now he goes into the kafara. Kafara. Which form is kafara? Kafaratun. It's a masdar. Of which form? Form 3. And form 3 only has 2 masdar. مفاعلة and فعال. مجاهدة جهاد. منافقة نفاق. مظاهرة ظهار. All the rest have only 1 except for one other one. 3, form 3 and form 2 both have more than 1. Form 3 only has 2. Form 2 has 5. One of them is fa'ala. Right? So the other masdar is takfir, right? Kaffar yukaffir, takfir. Right? And this one, kaffara, right? Hatta yukaffira, he mentioned just now. Until he makes expiation. So وَكَفَّارَةُ الظِّهَارِ عِتْقُ رَقَبَةٍ. Right, so the expiation for the zihar is to free a slave, which we mentioned already. So there's a nice note in here before we continue, that if he says to all of his wives that he does zihar to all of the wives, right, then he has to make 4 individual kafara, right? So the penalty for that is according to the number of wives, right? Same thing with talaq. If he were to make talaq to them, then the raj'a would be 4 separate raj'a, 4 separate iddah. So it would be multiplied according to the amount of women. But if he did ila, right, and you guys covered ila, what is ila?
Vowing to abstain.
Okay.
Vowing to abstain.
Yeah, to swear, right? So he says that ila is not like that, right? So if he were to swear to that he would not touch any of them, right, all 4 of them, right, and the amount of time, right, is 4 months, right, or more, right? Then it would only be one thing that he'd have to do, because the name of Allah is one, and the purpose of the ila is out of the sanctity of the name of Allah, right, being used in that sentence. So, and that is only one. He only used Allah's name once. Right, so the penalty is according to the amount of times Allah's name was used. If he said 1, 2, 3, he said Allah's name 4 times, swearing that he wouldn't, then it's 4 separate. But if he said once for all 4, it only counts as 1. So he says, وَكَفَارَةُ الظِّهَارِ عِتْقُ رَقَبَةٍ. The expiation for the zihar is 1 to free a slave. Free a slave. Now we mentioned here that he mentions here that it has to be done, that itq has to be done with the intention of kafara. Right, so the kafara needs the intention. فَإِن لَمْ يَجِدْ. Now we mentioned also, which he doesn't mention here, that it can be any slave. Right? Any slave where he has full milk. That it doesn't have to be a Muslim, or there's no specification of whether it's a Muslim slave or a non-Muslim slave. Whereas for qisas, it has to be a Muslim slave. Right? رَقَبَةً مُؤْمِنَةً. Allah mentioned specifically. So فَإِن لَمْ يَجِدْ, so he doesn't have a slave. Right? Our time there is, right, no slave. فَصِيَامُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعِينَ. Then his expiation is to fast for 2 consecutive months. Right? And we'll go into it that those 2 consecutive months have to be 2 months in a row in which there's no Ramadan, in which there's no Eid, there's no Ayyam al-Tashriq, right? The days where it's impermissible to fast in, right? Or days that you already have another fast obligated upon you, right? Like Ramadan. So it has to be outside of that time that he can do those. Because if he starts his 2 months and then boom, Eid comes, what's he gonna do, right? You're not allowed to fast in Eid, right? And if he doesn't fast, then he has to start all over, right? So he should wait until a time that he can do the full 2 months without any interrupting days in there. If he's not able to fast 2 months straight, maybe he's elder, maybe he's sick, right? Maybe he needs medicine, right? Experienced, just Muslim doctor with told him that you have to take this medicine every day, right? Or else something very bad will happen to you. Then he can't fast. So what is his option? فَإِطْعَامُ سِتِّينَ مِسْكِينًا. Then he has to feed 60 poor people. Right? لِلنَّصِّ الْوَارِدِ فِيهِ. Right? And this is clearly mentioned in the ayah. So the ayah, he says here, Allah. He mentions وَالَّذِينَ يُظَاهِرُونَ مِن نِسَائِهِمْ. Those who do dhihar to their wives, ثُمَّ يَعُودُونَ لِمَا قَالُوا. Then they go back on what they say. Then they must free a slave prior to touching each other, meaning prior to having intercourse. That is what you have been admonished about, and Allah knows well what you do. And if he does not find, when he doesn't find a slave, then to fast 2 months in a row prior to touching, right? So again, there's that condition that they can't. Until it's done, he cannot have intercourse with her. فَإِن لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ. If you cannot fast, then he feeds 60 poor people. That is so that you believe in Allah and His Messenger, and those are the boundaries of Allah, and for the disbelievers is a painful punishment. So it's very clearly stipulated there that if not this, then this. If not this, then this. So there's an order involved. Right? So if he's able to free a slave, he can't fast 2 months in a row. Right? So he has to do that. It's not a choice. So he says, فَإِطْعَامُ سِتِّينَ مِسْكِينًا وَكُلُّ ذَلِكَ قَبْلَ الْمَسِيسِ. And all of that is prior to touching. Mas is touching. Right? Meaning, here, intercourse. Right? Because it is haram for him to have intercourse until this expiation is finished. The Musannif continues, rahimahullah ta'ala, وَيُجْزِئُ فِي ذَلِكَ عِتْقُ الرَّقَبَةِ الْكَافِرَةِ وَالْمُسْلِمَةِ وَالذَّكَرِ وَالْأُنْثَى وَالصَّغِيرِ وَالْكَبِيرِ. Right? So it will suffice him if he frees a slave, even whether that slave be a disbelieving slave, a Muslim slave, a male slave, a female slave, a young slave, an old slave. All of that counts. But what doesn't count? And he'll mention the reason, right? That which is فَائِتَةِ الْمَنْفَعَةِ. That which, because the ideal of the slave is that there's a benefit in them. Right? If a person has a certain flaw which would take away from the benefit which a person would get from having a slave, then that would not count for him. Right? So he says, وَلَا تُجْزِئُ الْعَمْيَاء. A blind slave doesn't count. You can't free a blind slave. So the guy does dhihar, he's got 4 slaves, one of them is blind, he chooses that one because, right, it's less of a loss for him. No, it doesn't count. وَلَا الْمَقْطُوعَةُ الْيَدَيْنِ, nor a slave whose both hands are cut off. Obvious reasons, right? وَلَا الرِّجْلَيْنِ, nor a slave who has no feet, no legs. وَيُجُوزُ الْأَصَبْ, a deaf slave does count, right? Because a person, even though they can't hear, they can still work, right? They can still do things. They can still help out. والمقطوع إحدى اليدين إحدى الرجلين من خلاف, and somebody who is one hand and one foot from opposite sides are cut off, that still counts. So right hand, left leg, left hand, right leg. The Sharih, rahimahullah ta'ala, adds a few more, like a person who has both ears cut off, his nose cut off, right, missing an eye, and so forth, because they are not completely benefitless, you can say. ولا يجوز مقطوع إبهامي اليدين, nor a slave whose two thumbs are cut off, right? Because the thumbs are the place in which the strength of the hands are held, right? So a person can hold something because of the thumb. If they don't have any thumbs, then it's almost as if they don't have hands, right? And not having hands is one of the, he says both thumbs though, he stipulates both thumbs. ولا المجنون الذي لا يعقل, nor the crazy person who doesn't have intellect. One of the wisdoms is that we already mentioned a slave who doesn't have certain limbs, right? Well, the limbs are controlled by what? The intellect, right? So he doesn't have intellect, it's as if he has no limbs. Yes, all of the limbs are gone. Right? Because the benefit of the limbs is only according to the intellect. So if they're crazy, if they're insane, right, then the limbs are not going to do what they're supposed to be doing. He mentions here that if the majnun is his insanity or is not a permanent state, that he does have times of intellect, or he's conscious and comes to, then that would count. Even though it is a deficiency, but it does not completely remove the benefit of that slave. ولا يجوز عتق المدبر وأم الولد. Right, so there's other types of slave. The slave that was mentioned, raqaba, right, is a full slave, right, a complete slave. There are other types of slavery, I guess you could say, that are almost partial, because you can, if you have, for instance, the mudabbar, he tells his slave that when I die, right, you're free, right? So there's a hope of freedom there for him, for the walad, right? She's had his baby, so there's not complete riqiyya, there's not complete riqiyya. Okay, then mukatib. Same thing with the mukatib. Person says to his slave, if you pay me $1,000, then you're free, right? But it's a specific type of mukatib, right? So, وَالْمُكَاتَبِ الَّذِي أَدَّى بَعْضَ الْمَالِ. Right? So he already paid some of the money that was agreed upon, right? So the person says to his slave, you are free if you pay me $1,000, right? So he started paying 100, 200. He's part of the way there, because so now his slavehood is not full, right? It's almost as if each part he pays a part of him is free until he finishes the whole. Right? So in that case, it would for him to use this slave as his expiation would be almost using, Allah mentions, a slave, whereas he is using part of a slave, right, which will not count, right? Because it has to be the whole slave. So a slave with no hands, it's almost like a part of a slave, right? Because the benefit is not there. So this is in regards if he had already paid something. فإن أعتق مكاتبا لم يؤدي شيئا. If he frees a slave, a mukatab slave, they've made the agreement. You have to pay me 1,000 and then you're free, but he hasn't paid anything yet. Right? If he were to free that slave, then it counts. Jaza. Because at that time, since he hasn't paid anything, he's still a complete slave. Right? Okay, this next one is quite interesting. This goes to another masala. Inshallah, we'll see. We'll test you, inshallah. فإن اشترى أباه أو ابنه. If he buys his father, so for instance, his father is a slave, right? His son is a slave. And how could that happen? Maybe he's a slave, right? His son is also a slave. But the owner freed him, and not the son. Right? So now he's free, son's still a slave. So he figures, let me buy my son's freedom. So he buys his son with the intention of kafara, of expiating for the zihar that he did to the boy's mother. Right? So he says, yanwi bishira al-kafara, that he intends by means of buying that son, al-kafara, then it counts for him. Same thing, both the father and the son are slaves. The master frees the son. Right? Then the son, who is also married, he did zihar to his wife. He said, now I have to free a slave. I don't have a slave. Right? 2 months sounds like a long time to fast. Right? 60 days in a row. So let me buy my father's freedom with the intention of cover. Right? Because as soon as the son buys the father's free. Right? There's no need for an itq. Right? Because the son, so if he buys the father with the intention, then the kafara counts. It counts. But if, for instance, the son inherited, how would that work? If he inherited the father, right? And somebody left him in his will, right? You could take my slave. The slave happened to be his father, right? Then it doesn't count as his kafara because he didn't do anything. There was no action from his own side, right? The shira, the buying, is an action, right? Coupled with an intention that's as if he did it himself. It's as if he said to his own slave, "You're free for the sake of Allah in exchange for my expiation," right? Whereas if he just inherited, then he didn't do anything.
What if he was gifted a slave for that purpose?
Yeah, but him being gifted it,
for that specific purpose. So instead of like inheriting it, he's someone.
so if it's any other slave, we're supposed to be talking about the father or the son, right? Because there's certain implications there that, for instance, if he inherited a slave who's not related to him at all, right? Once he gets the slave, you're free for the sake of Allah for my kafara, no problem, right? But the son, immediately when the son buys the father, he's slave, he's free. So the buying of the father is yatq, right? So the buying has to be coupled with the intention, whereas him inheriting, right, is no action in here. There's no intention involved. There's no doing on his side. Right? So it won't count because he didn't do anything.
So if someone inherited their father, it wouldn't even be like he wouldn't even be his slave for a second. He just automatically become free.
Most likely. I should check on that though. I think you're right though. Should be right. There's a hadith about it. Anybody know the hadith? You have the Jawhara? Yeah? Okay, تمام. Where are we at? وإن أعتق نصف عبد مشترك عن الكفارة. Right, so the idea that a slave can be shared, right? I own, me and Hamza, we go and we buy a slave. I put up half, he puts up half. Right? So I own half, you own half. Right? So then if a person who did this with his partner, they bought a slave, half, he did jihad with his wife. Now he wants to go back on what he wants to undo what he has done. So he's like, okay, I free my half of the slave, right? Because he can't free the other person's half; it's not his ownership, right? I free. So he says, وَإِنْ أَعْتَقَ نِصْفَ عَبْدٍ مُشْتَرَكٍ, if he frees half of a slave who is shared, right? عَنِ الْكَفَارَةِ, and for his kafara, وَضَمِنَ قِيمَةَ بَاقِيهِ فَأَعْتَقَهُ لَمْ يَجُزْ عِنْدَ أَبِي حَنِيفَةَ. Then he takes on the responsibility to pay for the second half. So he frees his half, and he tells the other person, I will give you money for the other half, right? To take, so that he can free the person completely. Right? According to the Imam, rahimahullah ta'ala, it doesn't count. It does not count. But according to Sahibain, it does count. Why? Because he took ownership by means of his guarantee that I will pay you, right, for the other half, for your half. Because of that dhaman, him taking that responsibility, then he was given ownership of his partner's half, so that when he does do the freeing, it's as if he freed the whole slave, right? Which is his ownership. Right? So that was their opinion. But the Imam, he said, he had a differing opinion, and the Sahih seems to be on the qawl of Imam Abi Hanifa rahimahullah ta'ala. تمام. وضمن قيمة الباقي فعله ولم يجوز عند أبي حنيفة. وإن أعتق نصف عبده عن كفارته ثم أعتق باقيه عنها جاز. If he frees half of his own slave, and it's not a mushtarak slave, it's not something that is shared. He owns the whole slave, but he only frees half of it, half of him or her, right? عن كفارته, for the sake of his expiation. Then he later on frees the rest, the second half, then it counts, right? Because he freed the whole, even, I don't know why he didn't do it all at once, but he freed half and then half later, so he freed the whole thing. Yes. So, how does this happen? He did it in two separate sentences, right? I free half myself, I free the other half of myself. What does that mean? I free my whole slave, so it counts. Any question?
Sorry, I didn't understand the difference. If he frees half and then later frees the remainder, it's valid?
Yeah, because honestly, what he mentions here in Hidayah, in the Sharah, that him freeing half the slave already counts as freeing the whole slave, because he is not a shared ownership, right? The whole slave is his. You can't just free half of a person, right? When you're freeing, if it's shared ownership, you're freeing your ownership, right? You're absolving yourself of ownership of that part of the thing. But if you own the whole slave, you can't cut the slave in half, right? Right? You can't say so. If you say half, I free half the slave, it's as if you freed the whole one anyway from the first sentence. Because according to Sahibain, al-i'taq la yatajazza. There's no, you can't divide freeing a slave, right? Whereas when it's a shared, now you're dividing because of the ownership, not because of the slave.
Does the freeing of a slave have to be with niyyah?
With me. You mentioned here before. Yes, no? Where is it? عتق رقبة. If he mentions in the Sharah, where he says وَكَفَارَةُ بِهَارِ عِتْقُ رَقَبَةٍ from the beginning of the subject, that section, he says أي إعتاقها بنية الكفارة. بنية الكفارة. And same thing when we talked about buying a slave for that purpose, regarding his father, right, or the son, right, that الشراء بنية الكفارة. And because immediately once that contract happens, the freeing happened, right? So if he didn't already make the intention, he bought and then he's like, oh, I should have made. It's already, that person's free. He can't go back on that, right? But if he bought another slave, right? Anybody that is not his father or the son, and he said he bought him, then he doesn't need the intention when buying. But after he owns the slave, now he has to free with the intention. But because in regards to the father and the son, and the specific nas on that it has to be at the time of the buying, because the buying itself is the free. Because you can't own your father. It doesn't really work well at home anyway. Tell your father what to do. Come on. So he says, وَإِنْ عَتَقَ نَصْفَ عَبْدِهِ عَنْ كَفَّارَتِهِ ثم جامع التي ظهر منها ثم اعتق باقيه لم يجوز عند أبي حنيفة. Okay, so if he frees half of his own slave, right, for the kafara, and we mentioned this now in one of the opinions that freeing can't be divided into parts, right? He says if he frees half of his own slave for the kafara, and then he has intercourse with the same wife who he did bihar with, and then he frees the other half, right? It doesn't count according to Abu Hanifa. Why? Because according to Abu Hanifa, the freeing can be divided into parts, right? So that was the reason for the khilaf previously, that if he has a slave that is shared, right, and he frees his half, and then he takes responsibility for paying his partner for the other half, and then he frees the second half, then it doesn't count according to Abu Hanifa, because you can have two separate. But the Sahibain, they say, nope, that if you free half, it's as if you freed the whole. So he freed half, had intercourse, and then freed half. So this is the khilaf. This is where the problem starts, right? Because you can't have intercourse until the kafara is done, right? It's haram to have intercourse until the kafara is done. So if according to Abu Hanifa, you can have portions of i'tq, portions of i'taq. You can free a third, and then a third, and then a third, and then they're completely free. Half, and then a half. You can have portions. Then if you freed half and had intercourse, that intercourse is haram, because the kafara is not completely done yet, right? And the condition that is mentioned in the ayah is that the slave must be freed prior to having intercourse for it to count. Right? So because Imam Abu Hanifa holds the opinion that freeing can be done in parts, then for him it doesn't count. Right? But Sahibain said that freeing, there is no parts for freeing. You free half, it's as if you freed the whole. Right? So when he said, I free half of my slave from my kafara, and then he had intercourse, right? Then the slave was already 100% freed prior to the intercourse. Make sense? So the khilaf is, does freeing a slave, can it be divided into parts or no? Right? So the Imam said yes. Therefore, the whole slave must be freed prior to intercourse. Sahibain said you can't divide freeing of a slave into parts. Therefore, if any part of the slave was freed prior to the intercourse, then it's as if the whole slave was freed, and it counts as the whole slave being freed. And we mentioned before about that the Sahih, in regards to the previous masala, which is the same khilaf, was on the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah. Allah, I don't know if there's any. This is what he mentions here. The Tasheeh, وهذه من فروع تجزؤ العتق. Right. So the Tasheeh regarding the division of freeing, being divided into parts. قال الإسبيجابي فيه الصحيح قول أبي حنيفة وعلى هذا مشى المحبوبي والنسفي وغيرهما. So, make sense? وإذا لم يجد المظاهر ما يعتقه. And this goes back to the verse. If the person who did zihar doesn't find that which he can free, right? Meaning he doesn't have a slave. فَكَفَّارَتُهُ, then his kafara, his expiation is صَوْمُ شَهْرَيْنِ مُتَتَابِعِينَ, the fasting of 2 consecutive months. لَيْسَ فِيهِمَا شَهْرُ رَمَضَانِ. He can't say, okay, mashallah, Ramadan is 2 months from now. Right? So I'm going to fast the month before Ramadan. I'm going to fast Ramadan anyway. 2 months. There you go. No. ليس فيه ما شهر رمضان. It cannot include شهر رمضان. ولا يوم الفطر. Nor can it include Eid al-Fitr. So you can't immediately the last day of Ramadan immediately start his 2 months. You can't do that. Right? Because keep note, at this time, until he does the kafara, he can't have intercourse with his family. Right? So if it's the day before Ramadan, then technically he has to wait until Ramadan's over, till Eid is over, right? Then he can start his 2 months, right? Is there 2 months before Eid al-Adha? There is, right? Just enough time, right? Is it? Are you sure? Because it's 1 day of Eid.
2 months.
Shawwal, second of Shawwal, right?
So it's 2 months and 9 days.
Shawwal, Dhul Qa'dah, and yeah, he can barely make it. He's just barely make it. So maybe he's in a rush. He wants to do it right away. He does it on the Eid. No, he cannot do it, right? He has to wait till Eid is over. Wala yawm al-nahri, right? So if he doesn't do it on the starting on the 2nd of Shawwal, how many times? How long? 2 months.
2 months and 9 days.
2 months and 9 days. So he has tasweef. He procrastinates, right? The day of Eid al-Fitr, he procrastinates how many days? 8 days, right? He starts now, his last day of the 2nd month will land on Yawm al-Nahr, on Eid al-Adha. Cannot do it, right? ولا يوم النحر ولا أيام التشريق فإن جامع التي ظاهر منها في خلال الشهرين ليلا عاملا أو نهارا ناسيا استأنف الصوم عند أبي حنيفة ومحمد رحمهم الله تعالى. So he says, until he finishes the whole 2 months, he cannot have intercourse with his family because it's haram for him until he finishes the 2 months, and then she becomes halal for him again. right? So within that 2 months, if he has intercourse with her, he mentions here two specific qayd. Laylan amidan, at night intentionally, or by day forgetfully. Why does he mention these? Why? Because a person might think like, okay, I didn't break my fast, right? Because in a normal situation, when a person is fasting, they can have intercourse at night, right? Because the fast is only between Fajr and Maghrib. And if a person is on a normal fasting circumstance, and they were to have intercourse with their family nasiyan, forgetfully, it doesn't break the fast, right? If a person drinks or eats and they forgot that they were fasting, then it doesn't break the fast, right? So he might think, well, I'm not breaking my fast, so I'm allowed to have laydan, amidan, intentionally by night. Or if it happened, so for instance, he woke up and during the day, right, while fasting, forgetfully, he had intercourse with his family, then he has to start over the 2 months. He has to start over the 2 months according to Al-Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah and Imam Muhammad. Imam Abu Yusuf said no, because doing so does not negate the consecutive, is there a word like that? Consecutivity? The consecutiveness of the 2 months. Because Allah says fast 2 straight months, 2 months in a row, right? So him having intercourse at night intentionally never broke any one of his fasts. There were 60 fasts in a row, right? Having intercourse in a day forgetfully never broke any of the fasts. So it's still 60 fasts in a row. Because the fast didn't broke for that, and the condition in the ayah is the fasting. Right? 3 months, or 2 months straight. But for Imam Abu Hanifa rahimahullah and Imam Muhammad, he says that the condition in regarding to the fasting is that both 2 months must be done prior to prior to them both touching, meaning prior to the intercourse. Right, which would necessitate automatically, by the way that the ayat is worded, that massa, right, that masis, or that intercourse, does not happen within the 2 months. So if this 2 months has to happen before intercourse, right, that would necessitate that the intercourse is not within the 2 months, right, because that would go against the word before, right? So if I said, buy me 2 apples before you come in the house, right? And you buy 1 apple and enter the house. That defeated the whole purpose, right? I wanted to do 2 apples, right? So both of the apples must be bought prior to entering the house. Terrible example, but really weird example. Alhamdulillah. So according to him, you would have to start over from the beginning. And this is mentioned in Hidayah, and he mentions in Zad al-Fuqaha that the Sahih is the opinion of Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Muhammad, and Imam al-Burhani, wa Nasafi, wa Sadr al-Sharia. They all take in this opinion as well. So he would have to start all over. Even if he was forgetful with A or intentionally by name. وَإِنْ أَفْطَرَ يَوْمًا مِنْهُمَا بِعُذْرٍ أَوْ بِغَيْرِ عُذْرٍ اسْتَأْنَفَ. If he did not fast, right? So that previous masala was only in the situation where he did fast. There was no deficiency in his fast, right? His fast was not invalidated by any of the things that he did, right? But in the situation that he doesn't fast, right? Whether it's because of an udhr, maybe he was sick that day, right? Maybe he was traveling that day, right? Because we know in traveling it's not obligatory to fast in Ramadan. Or without an udhr, I don't feel like fasting today, right? Then he has to start over from the beginning. It has to be 60 days, 60 fasts straight. It has to be 2 months straight. Better not to say 60 days, because if they see the hilal, right, the month, well, if he starts in the middle of the month, is 60 days a shart? It's your homework, inshallah. is 60 days or is it any 2 months?
I think it was.
You mentioned it? Okay,
128.
128. Wow.
In the middle, right under the full.
نعم فإن صام بالأيام وأفطر ل59 فعليه الاستقبال. ما شاء الله. If he fasts and calculates his fast according to days, right, and not according to months, then, and one of the reasons for that is that he didn't start at the beginning of the month, right? Like we mentioned, the first of Shawwal is Yom al-Nahr, right? It's Eid, that he cannot, it's not Yom al-Nahr, it's Eid al-Fitr. So he figured, I'll start on the second, right? So now the end of the month isn't considered, that would only be 29 days at the most, right? So it says if he fasts by count of days and he stops fasting after finishing 59 days, 59 days, right? Then he has to start over. عليه الاستقبال. Istiqbal is used many times as istitnaf, to start over. كما في المحيط. ولو صام 29 يوما بالهلال, if he counted by months, right? And one of those months ended up being 29 days. And if he were to count by, so if he goes by months, yes, and the month ends up being 29 days, or if he counts by days, it has to do 30 days. That is permissible. Right? But if he counts by days and he does 29, no. If he counts by months, then he can do 29 if it is 20, if that month is 29. Make sense? لو قدر على التحرير وضع في آخر اليوم الأخير لازم يعتقه يومه لازم جميعا. Some nice fawaid here. He says that if he starts the fast, he doesn't have a slave, he starts his fast, and at the end of his 60 days, he acquires a slave. He has to free the slave. He has to free the slave. Right? And he should still finish the 60 days. Nadban. Mustahab. Mustahab for him to finish the 60 days.
It is almost mustahab for him to abstain from intercourse during the night.
That would be the point of the extra day. And it would just be a regular, it wouldn't have any shut off to just be a regular fast. The fact that he's one more day away from finishing the 60, right? Without having intercourse in the middle, then the mustahabness, the mustahabbility of that extra day is because he's still not going to have an intercourse, right? Even though it's allowed, he's going to leave that even just to finish the 60 days, right? خروجا من الخلاف, because of the word متتابعين, and Allah says consecutive. Right? So then, after that 60th day, according to both, right, the raqaba and the 60 days, it's completely halal. Right? But it's not necessary. One second. He mentions a few good points. That his fasting of 2 months cannot include Ramadan, because Ramadan is a fard in the place of which no other fard can be there. Right? So we know in the chapter of Psalm, do you guys do something? That in Psalm, if a person wakes up on the day of Ramadan, right, or before Fajr, he says, I'm going to fast nafil today. It counts as Ramadan, because you can't combine two intentions in a fast, because fast takes up the whole day, which is different than salat, right? So in a salat time, like for instance the time of dhuhr, right, you could choose to pray nafil, right, and you could choose to pray the dhuhr, you could choose to pray the fajr, right? So he can't make intention of nafil and then consider that to count for his dhuhr, because it's possible for him to have prayed one or the two, because the time can include many different things. You could pray a lot of nafil and still pray dhuhr, Whereas in fasting, one day is for one fast. You can't combine two fasts in one day. As far as Yom al-Fitr, Yom al-Nahr, and the Ayyam al-Tashriq, right, it's because it's been prohibited on those days. So it's as if a fasting on a day would be deficient, because and so you can't use that deficient fast to fulfill a complete request of a fast or a complete necessity of doing a fast. So, what was your question?
Where was that discussion that we're talking about the days of the month?
Right here, page 128.
I don't want to see.
Where he says, ليس فيهما شهر رمضان. ليس فيهما شهر رمضان in the footnotes. In the sharah. In the sharah. Okay, tamam. So if he chooses not to fast, or he breaks his fast, he started, then he broke it, one day during the 2 months with an excuse or without an excuse, he still has to start over. Now it gets interesting. وَإِنْ ظَاهَرَ الْعَبْدُ, if a slave, and we know that a slave can be married, right? And he can be with his spouse whenever he gets free time. Because the preference for the slave is to fulfill the rights of his master, right? But in regards to him being married, then he can be with his spouse whenever there's nothing requested from him by the master. So this slave, he says to his wife, "Anti alayya ka dhahri ummi," you are like the back of my mother, right? So the lihar has occurred. Now if he wants to take her back. Obviously, we mentioned if he doesn't want to take her back, then it becomes talaq ba'in. If he intends to take her back, then he cannot free a slave, right? So the only thing he can do is he goes straight to the fasting, right? So we mentioned before, for a normal situation, that first is if you don't have a slave, if you have a slave, you have to free the slave. If you don't have a slave, then you can fast. But for the slave, he doesn't own anything. Anything he owns is actually in the ownership of his master, right? Even himself. Right? As Allah says in the Quran, ضرب الله مثلا رجلين أحدهما أبكم لا يقدر على شيء وهو كل على مولاه لا يقدر على شيء. He doesn't own anything. Right? وهو كل على مولاه, and he's a burden for his master. Right? It's a simile that Allah makes about two different believers and non-believers. But he mentions that the slave, لا يقدر على شيء, he doesn't own anything. Right? So he can't, the freeing of a slave would necessitate that he owns a slave, which he himself doesn't even own himself. Right? So he goes straight to fasting, 2 months. فإن أعتق المولى عنه أو أطعمه لم يجزه. So if the slave starts to fast, here's an interesting surah. Well, let's translate it first. If the master frees on his behalf, he frees another one of his slaves on his behalf, or he feeds 60 poor people on his behalf, it does not count for that slave's kafara. Right, so situation. Slave, what's your name besides? I don't want to use the patented names. Okay, a slave, he has done bihar with his wife, and now he wants to go back on what he's done. So he can't free a slave, obviously, so he starts to fast. But the master notices that now his work, the quality of his work around the house and service has gone down exponentially because of his 60-day fasting in a row. So the master has mercy on him and says, on your behalf, I'll free another one of my slaves. Right? It won't count for him. It does not count. He has to fast 2 months consecutive. Right, so the kafara, right, there's kafara bil mal, right, there's kafara, some kafaras are done by money, right, some kafara are done by fasting. We have other ones also, when a person, kafara to yameen, right, we have, there's a few types of kafara that are done with fasting. As far as kafara with wealth, slaves are not in that category. They cannot do that. So they have to automatically go to kafara with fasting. So. Any questions? The next goes to another subject, another topic.
Why wouldn't someone just discount it as a bet in divorce then and just do another nikah? Especially for the slave, like, because it would be so much of a difficulty on him.
Maybe she doesn't want. Maybe if it was a bet in divorce, and then he says, "Will you marry me?" She says, "No." And she has a choice. But since she already said yes before when they first got married, she's stuck. She's with him, and he has the control of the marriage, right? She can't divorce herself. She can ask for khula', as we mentioned before, but maybe if he did that, he fears that she would say no, right? Or he fears that her parents will take her away and make her say no, right? Allah, I don't know why people do things, but people do what they do. Maybe he doesn't even have the niyyah. Like you mentioned, people do things without niyyah. وَإِنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعِ الْمُظَاهِرُ الصِّيَامِ If the person is not able to fast. أطعم 60 مسكينا كل مسكين نصف صاع من بر أو صاع من تمر أو شعير أو قيمة ذلك. So then he has to feed 60 poor people, each poor person getting half a saw of wheat, or half a saw of tamar, or half a saw of barley, or the value of that. Now the word miskin is what they mentioned. What's the qaydun ittifaqi, right? That it doesn't have to be miskin. Any of the asnaf of zakat would be valid for this. Also, it being 60 separate miskin is not necessity, right? What is a necessity is that it'am, feeding of a person, happens 60 times, right? So if he fed the same exact miskin 60 days in a row, it would also count, right? Because the point of it'am is to give food to somebody and to fulfill that need of food for that person, right? So if he fed him breakfast, that would be one. That would fulfill. Did it fulfill its task? Yes. If he fed him dinner that same day, same person, same day, it would also fulfill it, because it's an it'am. It'am, you're feeding somebody who would not have already been eating if you hadn't helped him. So he says, if he's not able to fast, either because of such a sickness, but there is no expectation of it being cured, right? Person has a debilitating disease or a major sickness. Oh, kibari sinnan, or he's so old, he's so high in age that he's not able to fast. Then he or somebody on his behalf, or not on his behalf, but by command of him, like wakala, an agency from him, will have to feed 60 people. So if he said to his son, go feed 60, he's old. He can't even fast. He expected him to go find 60 people and feed them all. So he tells his son, take this and go feed those people. It counts. It's fine. Right? لِجَوَازِ صَرْفِهِ إِلَى غَيْرِهِ مِنْ مَصَارِفِ الزَّكَاةِ. So he mentions that the miskin is a qayd ittifaqi. Qayd ittifaqi means that it's not limited to that thing. Right? Ittifaqi means coincidental. لجواز صرف لغة not اصطلاح. تمام. ولا يجزئ غير المراهق. But the person who is eating the food has to be. It cannot be a child. It has to be a person of murahaqa, adolescence, a person who the signs of bulugh, the signs of him being of puberty, age of purity, are starting to show. It's in murahiq. There's a lot of ahkam that relate to the murahiq. Like Like for instance, the adhan. It's jaiz for the adhan to be done by a murahiq, but it's not jaiz كذلك وأيضا يجوز للمراهق وكره وكره من جنوب أو فاسق كذلك المجنون والسكران والمرأة والطفل فالأذان يعاد. Right? For a child, then the adhan is repeated, but for a murahiq, technically not baligh, but almost at that age, then it counts. It's fine. You don't have to repeat it. But that's another chapter. Let's try to finish this chapter. He says, Allah, or قيمة ذلك, or the amount you can use money instead. So the amount of sa' min bur, of a nis sa' min bur, of a complete sa' of tamar or sha'ir, you can give the amount of that in money because the whole point is to fulfill a need, and to and the money does that just fine. Sometimes better, right? And this is the same. This goes back to the similar in zakat, right? So you go to a person, right? In regards to zakat, say your only nisab is goats, right, or camels, right? You go to a person, you give him a goat, right? He's got plenty of food, but he has to pay his mortgage or his rent, right? He can't pay his rent with a goat. So sometimes the money and the qima is better because it fulfills the purpose. So he says, فَإِنْ غَدَّاهُمْ وَعَشَّاهُمْ جَازًا. So if he gave غَدَّا, which is lunch, وَعَشَّا, which is dinner, then it's permissible. Whether what they ate was a lot or little. Right? Because the idea here is it'am, to feed. Right? So the word to feed is for somebody to take from some food and eat it. Right? From your food and to eat it, that you fed them. So he says, right, so and this would also count. Let's not go into that. He says, وَإِنْ غَدَّاهُمْ وَعَشَّاهُمْ جَازًا. If you give them lunch and dinner, then it's enough. It's sufficient. قَلِيلًا مَا أَكَلُوا أو كثيرا, be it little what they ate or a lot. فإن أعطى مسكينا واحدا 60 يوما أجزأه. If he gives, meaning he gives food, he feeds one poor person for 60 days in a row, then it's sufficient. وإن أعطاه في يوم واحد, if he feeds him within one day, لم يجزه إلا عن يومه. Before the second sentence, prior to that, when he talks about the one miskin for 60 days, he says, because the point of feeding, of the it'am, right, is to fulfill somebody the need of a needy person, and that need is found every day, right? So one person, right, who is miskin, right, who needs food, if you feed him one day, tomorrow he also needs food, right? And the day after that he also needs food, and the day after that he also needs food. So since the need is repetitive, then you can continuously give to that same person as long as that need is there. So feeding him on the second day is just does the same effect as feeding him the first day. You fulfilled a need. But as far as the second one, if he gives the same person multiple times in one day, right? even if it was more than one time. Right? So he fed one person in one day, but more than one time, even if it's more than one time, then it doesn't count except for on that day, for the day itself. Why? Because there's no real ta'addud, division of parts. But he mentions, like for instance, a person in Hajj has to do the Ramy al-Jimar. We talked about this, right? That he has to throw 7 rocks. Right? If he takes 7 rocks and he throws all of them at one time, it only counts as one. Right? Because that thing demands that 1, 2, 3. So if he gave the person 3 meals in one shot, right? Then it only counts as 1. Right? It only counts for that one day. وإن قرب التي ظهر منها في خلال الإطعام لم يستنف. This is very important as far as usul is concerned. So if he has intercourse with the spouse who he did zihar with during the feeding, so he fed 30 miskin, then he had intercourse, right? Then he doesn't have to start over. Why? Because in the ayah, Allah says, وَمَنْ لَمْ يَسْتَطِعْ فَإِطْعَمُ سِتِّينَ مِسْكِينًا ذَلِكَ لِتُؤْمِنُوا بِاللَّهِ وَرَسُولِهِ. He never said مِنْ قَبْلِ أَن يَتَمَاسَّ, prior to them touching, right? Whereas other of the Imam and other schools, they said, no, the same hukum applies to all 3, with qiyas on the first 2. That during the sittin and miskina, he has to also refrain from having intercourse, and he has to feed all 60 before having intercourse, or else he has to start over, right? And why? Because the first 2 made it a condition, he stipulated the condition that it has to be prior to intercourse. So the third one, qiyasan, would be applied as well, but for us, no. Allah didn't mention it, so therefore we don't take that to be a condition. So if you were to have intercourse during this feeding, and this is obviously if he doesn't have a slave, if he can't fast, and he ends up in the third category where he has to feed 60 people, then within that, if he were to have intercourse with his spouse, he doesn't have to start over.
If a slave doesn't have ownership over any of his own wealth, and if he is unable to fast, how can he come back from the harm?
Good question. Allahu A'lam. There was one situation that a man, he was supposed to do kafara for something, and the Prophet told him, do this as your kafara, and it was about sadaqah, you give money, and he said, I don't have any money, I'm the poorest person in the whole village, right? So the Prophet said, okay, then feed, right? I don't have any food, right? So the Prophet said, take these dates and give it to somebody. He said, Ya Rasulullah, I'm the most needy of the people. He said, okay, then you eat them. Right, so, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. The real answer is, I don't know, but if a slave doesn't have, the only thing he can do is fast. Then he says, Lam yujzihi fil kafarati illa as-sawm. Right? Nothing will suffice for his kafara except for fast. So if he can't fast, then what is he going to do? There's no other option. But in regards to this person who doesn't have a slave, can't fast, then he has to feed 60 people. If he were to have intercourse, which is not permissible, right, prior to finishing the 60 feedings, then he doesn't have to start over, because the Quran is mutlaq, is general in this regard, so we cannot specify it without any, so it will remain mutlaq, right? until there's a reason to specify. ومن وجب عليه كفارتا ظهارا فأعتق رقبتين لا ينوي عن إحداهما بعينها جاز عنهما. If a person has to pay 2 expiations for zihar, so we mentioned already that يتعدد, that there can be multiple zihar according to him saying to a multitude of wives that the same statement that they're like the back of the mother. So he mentions here that either he owes 2 expiations for one wife or for 2 wives. How could it have 2 expiations for one wife? What do you guys think?
If he says something like, you are like my mother's back, and before that, you were like my mother's back.
MashaAllah, that's complex. Anyone else? That's one opinion.
And he says 2 different things, like you are like my mom's thigh and my mom's back.
Okay, alright.
He just said it multiple times.
Yeah, the third one is most likely that one. He does it, now the kafara is upon him. Right. But he hasn't done it yet. And then he does it again. Right? Or he did the, how would that work? Maybe you can do it multiple times. Not at all. Can you do it multiple times is the question. If she's already in that state of zihar, can he do it upon her again? Is there any manner to say that he can? These are all good questions to prepare. When Sheikh Faraz comes back, just one all at once. No, not at all at once. When there's proper time, proper situation. Alright, one at a time, when he's free, when he's asking any questions. That's the proper thing. So he says that whoever owes 2 kafara bihar, or so obviously if he has 2 wives, then the situation is clear. Right? But the Sharah mentions min imra'atin aw imra'atin. So that's the question. Min imra'atin, what is the question? As far as imra'atin, there's no question. So whoever owes 2 kafara for zihar, and he frees 2 slaves, he does one of them he didn't make niyyah, specific niyyah for that slave and that kafara, then it still counts for both of them. And the same ruling applies. He says, وَكَذَلِكَ إِذَا صَامَ أَرْبَعَةَ أَشْهُرٍ. If you fast 4 months, right? أَوْ أَطْعَمَ 120 مِسْكِينًا. He feeds 120 miskin, and it counts again for both of them. وَإِنْ أَعْتَقَ رَقَبَةً وَاحِدَةً أَوْ صَامَ شَهْرٍ كَانَ لَهُ أَنْ يَجْعَلَ ذَلِكَ عَنْ أَيَّتِهِمَا شَاءَ. But if he frees only one slave, and he does the sum version of the kafara one time, so that'll be 60 days for each, right? And then they ask, well, which wife did you do it for? Did you do it for me or did you do it for her? Right? Then he gets to choose, and he can choose whichever of the 2 he wants. Obviously, this is if he had not already specified. Maybe his niyyah was, I am freeing this slave for kafara of dhihar. Right? But he didn't specify which of the 2 wives is he doing the kafara for. So then, if it happens like that, then he gets to choose. That's if he only frees one slave, or only fasts 2 months. But if he frees 2 slaves, after having done dhihar from 2 wives, then, and he only made the intention for one, then it counts. They give it to him. The end of the any question? I thought we were going to reach beyond, like, I forgot how big this chapter is. Alhamdulillah. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم الحمد لله رب العالمين.
I didn't catch the full point, but I think when you were talking about feeding people, whether it be 60 to one person or whoever it may be, do the people being fed have to be baligh? Is that what, like, I don't
They
know.
have to be at least murahiq or baligh. So murahiq is technically not baligh, right? It's the person on which the signs of bulugh, the first signs of bulugh have already shown up. But there's no ihtiram, there's no certain, right? There's no certain sign of bulugh. Right, so that murahiq or higher. So if he's just a child, then it won't count. It has to be murahiq or higher.
Why doesn't it count for children? Like, wouldn't children be more in need than someone who's older who can get a job or who can, you know?
Maybe that's the thing, right? The person could get it, and the child has somebody, right? Has a parent, right? Allah, I don't know what the hukm of the sharia. But this is what the ulama, al-amilun al-rabbaniyun have mentioned. He was first.
Could someone make an explicit lihar and intend that as, like, it's the words of lihar, but they're intending a divorce?
I don't think there's no need for an intention. The only reason that intention was considered in the other ones because it's unclear. The wording was unclear. But if the wording is clear, then there's no need for an intention.
So even if you intended divorce, it would count as lihar.
Yeah.
Second question is there a time limit in which one has to do the kafara?
Well, she's haram for him until he does. Technically, no. Technically, the nikah is still there. It's not like iddah, right? If the talaq calls an iddah. There's a time period you have to take back. But here, there's no time period. But until he does it, she's haram for him.
So it's not like ilah.
It's not like what?
It's not like ilah.